June the 2nd, 1967. Operation Union 2 is 6 days old, and the Marines of Fox Company, 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines, are moving through a rice paddy in the Khe Sanh Valley, chasing a regiment of North Vietnamese regulars that keeps disappearing into the tree lines. It is almost noon. The paddy looks empty. It is not. And the man who is about to prove that, the man who is about to open fire on his own former comrades, hidden under straw mats laid flat in the mud, is not wearing a Marine Corps uniform out of loyalty. 12 months earlier, he was one of the men in that tree line. Today, he is the only reason Fox Company will walk out of this valley. This is not a story about a rescue. This is not even really a story about a battle. This is a story about what happens to the word enemy when a man spends a year deciding quietly that the war he was fighting was not the one he was told he was fighting, and about the 11 months of suspicion, half-trust, and outright threats he survived on the American side before anyone believed him enough to hand him a rifle and walk beside him into a firefight. His name, as the Marines who served with him wrote it down, was Truong Kinh. He was a Kit Carson Scout. And on this particular afternoon, in this particular paddy, he did something that even the men who distrusted him most would never be able to explain away again. To understand what Truong Kinh did in that rice paddy, you have to go back to the spring of 1966, to an idea nobody in the Marine Corps had a name for yet. It began, almost by accident, with a group of Viet Cong who walked out of the jungle near Da Nang and surrendered to the 9th Marines, hoping for exactly what the South Vietnamese government's Chieu Hoi, open arms, program had promised them: amnesty in exchange for information. The enemy, predictably, spread a rumor that the Marines had tortured and executed one of them, a man named Ngo Van Bay. The regiment's colonel made an unusual decision. Instead of hiding Bay, he sent him back into the village he'd come from, alive, unharmed, walking, to prove the rumor false with his own body. It worked. And somewhere in the aftermath of that small, strange experiment, an officer in the 5th Counterintelligence Team at the Da Nang Chieu Hoi Center had a bigger idea. If a former enemy soldier could walk back into his own village and be believed, what else could he do? He could walk point. He could read a trail the way no American ever would. He could tell, from the angle of a broken reed or the smell of a cook fire, that something was wrong. Major General Herman Nickerson, Jr., commanding the 1st Marine Division, approved the program and gave it its name, Kit Carson Scouts, after the American frontier scout who had once guided soldiers through hostile country he alone understood. On November 10th, 1966, the Marine Corps' own birthday, the first 2 scouts, Vo Van Tam and Huyen Ngoc Chan, both former Viet Cong platoon commanders, walked out on their first patrol beside a 20-year-old Marine private who had just finished 6 weeks of Vietnamese language school. Neither side entirely trusted the other. Both sides needed each other to survive the next hour. By the end of that year, 17 scouts were serving with Marine and Army units across South Vietnam. Within 3 years, that number would pass 2,000. Some of them would die for a uniform that had, 12 months earlier, been trying to kill the man wearing it. The record does not preserve where Truong Kinh was born, or which village raised him, or the exact month he decided to walk toward an American perimeter with his hands empty and open. What the record does preserve, from the RAND studies that interviewed hundreds of men who made the same choice, and from the pattern every officer who ran the program came to recognize, is the shape of that decision, even where the details of one man's version of it are lost. Most of the earliest Kit Carson Scouts did not defect over ideology. They defected over malaria they could not get treated, wounds that would kill them without a hospital, food that never came, promises about liberation that had stopped meaning anything after 2 or 3 years in the tree lines. Some defected out of grief, some out of exhaustion. Some, like a man named Phan Chot, who would later serve with the American Division, defected even after an American unit had killed his own daughter, because he had by then run out of other options, and because staying meant certain death in a war he no longer believed his side could win. By the time Truong Kinh crossed over, sometime before June of 1967, into a program that was, at that point, barely 6 months old, he would have known exactly what he was risking. If the Viet Cong caught a rallier, the sentence was usually death, sometimes preceded by torture as a warning to others. If South Vietnamese soldiers caught him alone, he could expect no better. To them, a man who had once wielded a rifle for the other side would always be a man who might wield one again. And if the Americans he now served did not trust him, and at first almost none of them did, he would spend his days walking 3 steps ahead of men who kept their rifles half raised in his direction, waiting to see if today was the day he led them into a kill zone. He accepted all of it. He signed up anyway. By late May of 1967, the men of Fox Company had already learned to hate the Quezon Valley in the specific way infantry learns to hate a piece of ground that keeps taking friends and giving nothing back. It was rich farmland, some of the most fertile rice country in Acor, which was precisely why the North Vietnamese army wanted it, and precisely why the 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines had been sent to take it away from them. Operation Union, the first phase, had already cost the battalion dearly against a PAVN regiment that fought with a discipline the Marines were not used to seeing from guerrillas, because these were not guerrillas. These were regulars, dug into fortified positions, fighting like an army because they were one. When Union 2 opened on May 26th, the mission was simple on paper and brutal in practice. Find the regiment again and finish what Union 1 had started. The terrain did not help. Rice paddies offered no cover and total visibility in both directions. Tree lines that looked empty from 200 meters could hide a platoon close enough to touch, and the men the Marines were hunting had spent years learning how to disappear into ground, exactly like this, which meant that by the time Fox Company's lead elements reached the stretch of paddy on the morning of June 2nd, tired, 6 days into the operation, watching a tree line that had already cost them blood, twice that week, nobody was under the illusion that empty ground meant empty ground. What none of them could have predicted was that the man walking with them that morning, the Kit Carson Scout most of the company still eyed sideways, was about to see something none of the rest of them could. Program policy said a Kit Carson Scout was to be treated, for pay and rations, roughly like an American sergeant. Program policy did not say how a rifleman who had buried friends to North Vietnamese fire was supposed to feel about patrolling beside a man who, a year earlier, might have been the one pulling that trigger. Across the program, that tension was constant and rarely spoken about gently. Some Marines drew the line without apology, telling their assigned scout, in plain terms, exactly what would happen if he ever stepped out of place. Officers who ran scout programs at the divisional level later admitted the same thing more diplomatically. A former enemy was, by definition, a man who had already proven he could kill Americans competently. Trusting him with a weapon, a map, and a spot at the front of a patrol column was not procedure. It was a daily act of faith that most units made grudgingly, one patrol at a time, and revoked instantly at the first hint that it had been misplaced. Fox Company was no exception. By June of 1967, Truong Kinh had walked enough patrols with the battalion to have earned a place near the point, the position reserved for the man whose eyes the unit trusted most to read the ground first. It was not full trust. It was closer to a suspended judgment. He had not yet given them a reason to pull him back, and in a war where the ground itself lied to you, that was as close to trust as most of these men had left to give anyone. That was where things stood on the morning of June 2nd, and that is the trust that was about to be tested in front of the entire company all at once, with no time to think about it. Fox Company crossed into the paddy just before noon. The dikes were low, the water shallow, the surface broken up by scattered mats of cut straw laid out to dry in the sun. An ordinary sight in farm country, the kind of detail a tired eye slides straight past. Truong Kinh eye did not slide past it. He had spent years of his life learning exactly this terrain from the other direction, learning how a unit hides when it has nowhere else to hide, learning what a rice paddy looks like when men are lying flat beneath the waterline with a woven mat pulled over their faces, breathing through cupped hands, waiting for the enemy to walk close enough to guarantee the ambush. He had probably done it himself once on the other side of a rifle, pointed the opposite way. That knowledge, dangerous, intimate, the kind no American training course could teach, was the entire reason the Marine Corps had built a program to put men like him in front of a rifle company in the first place. He stopped walking. He raised his weapon toward a mat lying flat in 6 inches of water 20 meters ahead, a shape that had told the rest of Fox Company nothing at all. And then, before anyone beside him had time to ask why, Truong Kinh opened fire. For a half second, nobody in Fox Company understood what they were seeing. Their own scout, weapon up, firing into what looked like an empty patch of drying straw in the middle of a rice paddy. The kind of thing that, on a different day, with a less proven man, might have gotten him shot by his own company on suspicion alone. Then the mats moved. What had looked like straw laid out to dry became, in the space of a breath, a line of North Vietnamese soldiers rising out of the paddy water where they had been lying submerged, weapons already half raised, an ambush built and ready and about to be sprung on Marines who had walked straight toward it with no idea it was there. Kin's shots had beaten them to the trigger by seconds that, in that kind of ground, are the entire distance between an ambush that works and one that fails. The rest of Fox Company reacted the way infantry trained under fire reacts, fast and together. Rifles came up along the whole advancing line. The paddy that had been silent a moment earlier became a single continuous roar, mud and water kicking up in sheets where rounds went low, men from both sides dropping in place because there was nowhere in that open ground to run to. Kin did not stop after the first mat. He moved down the line of hidden fighters the way a man moves who already knows exactly where the next one is lying, because he did. The fighting in that stretch of paddy did not resolve in a single volley. It ground on close and ugly for the better part of an hour. The kind of fight where a man loses count of how many times he has fired and reloaded, where the line between still moving forward and pinned in place blurs into something no after-action report can fully capture. Kin kept working. By his own account, given afterward, he believed he had killed somewhere near 50 men that day. What made it into the official record, counted and confirmed, as Fox Company pushed forward across the paddy afterward, was 31 North Vietnamese regulars, men from the same army Kin had once worn the same uniform as, found dead where they had been hiding beneath the straw mats he alone had recognized for what they were. Marines who had spent 11 months watching him with one hand near their rifles were now watching him clear a kill zone that would otherwise have been walking straight into their own. Wounded men went down elsewhere along the line as the ambush that had failed to spring cleanly turned into a running fight across open ground, and more than one account from that day describes Marines being pulled to safer footing under fire, the ordinary, unglamorous work of an infantry company taking care of its own in the middle of chaos, the kind of work that does not distinguish between which uniform is doing the pulling. One rifleman put it afterward in words that have survived better than almost anything else from that day. There had been, he admitted, a real discomfort among some of the men when Kin first joined them, a plain dislike of fighting alongside someone who used to shoot at Marines for a living. After Union 2, he said, that feeling was gone. More than gone. The men who had distrusted him most were, by his account, the ones most relieved he had been walking beside them that morning. The ambush that was supposed to catch Fox Company by surprise never had the chance to become the fight the North Vietnamese regiment had planned. What should have been Marines walking blind into concealed fire across open ground became instead a fight the company entered already knowing where the enemy was. A difference that, in a rice paddy with no cover in any direction, is very often the entire difference between a company that survives an ambush and one that does not. By the time the paddy went quiet, Fox Company held the ground. The North Vietnamese survivors who could still move fell back toward the tree lines they had used all week to disappear. The same tree lines that had cost the battalion blood twice already that operation. This time, they left 31 of their own behind them in the mud, uncounted among the men still unaccounted for elsewhere in the wider engagement. Because June the 2nd was not a single contained skirmish. It was one violent morning inside 6 days of continuous contact across the whole Quezon Valley, in an operation that would end before it was over, with hundreds of North Vietnamese dead and well over 100 Marines killed or wounded across its full length. None of that wider arithmetic changes what happened in that one stretch of paddy. A man who had once belonged to the army lying beneath those straw mats had just made sure that the men beside him, men who, that same morning, still were not entirely sure they trusted him, walked out of it standing up. The record does not tell us what became of Truong Kinh after that morning, whether he stayed with Fox Company through the rest of Union 2, whether he served out the war, whether he was among the roughly 230 to 369 Kit Carson Scouts who would eventually die wearing an American-issued uniform for a country he was not born a citizen of. That silence is its own kind of answer. Most of these men do not appear again in the record after the action that made them briefly notable. Divisional newspapers ran his story with a photograph, Historians decades later would find that photograph and that story again, buried in an after-action report. Nobody had thought to connect back to his name until the connection was made explicit in later research. In between, there is nothing. That is not unusual. It is, if anything, the rule. The program itself outlived the war by only a few years. It kept growing after June 1967, past 100 scouts, past 1,000, past 2,000 at its peak in 1970, before the same withdrawal that pulled the Marines out of our Corps pulled the program apart with them. What was left of it was renamed, folded into South Vietnamese structures, and quietly wound down as American units went home. Somewhere in the paperwork of that drawdown are the names of every Kit Carson Scout who died in the uniform, a number large enough to matter, small enough that almost none of the men in it were ever known outside the units they served with. If there is a single document that names what actually happened in that valley, not the tactics, but the thing underneath the tactics, it is not a diary or a confession. It is a line buried in the after-action report for Operation Union 2 itself, in the section where officers wrote down what they had learned for the next unit that would need to learn it. It reads, almost dryly, almost bureaucratically, that the effective use of a Kit Carson Scout is limited only by the imagination of the commander who has one. It takes a moment to understand why that sentence is the real center of this story. It is not a sentence about loyalty or courage or redemption, the words a narrator might reach for. It is a sentence about capability, written by men who had just watched a former enemy save their company and who chose, in the coldest possible military language, to record that fact as a lesson rather than a miracle. That is the real discovery buried in the Union 2 report. Not that a man could change sides, but that an army built to fight an enemy defined by uniform and nationality had accidentally discovered something stranger. That the line separating enemy from asset was never fixed. It was a decision made and remade, one patrol at a time, by men on both sides of a rifle who had run out of better options. There is no interview with Truong Kinh in his own words decades later, reflecting on that morning, the kind of closing quote this story would want if it were fiction. What survives instead is smaller, and, in its way, more honest. The plain report of the men who watched him that day, the after-action lesson his commanders wrote down, the number 31 printed in a document that has no interest in whether the man who earned it was ever forgiven for the uniform he used to wear. Somewhere in the Khe Sanh Valley, on the morning of June 2, 1967, a rice paddy that looked empty was not, and the man who knew that before anyone else did had spent the previous year of his life on the other side of that exact deception, learning it the way you only learn something that might kill you. He did not fight that morning to prove a point about loyalty. He fought because the ground told him something true, and because, by then, the men around him were the only side he had left to stand on. Whatever the war took from him afterward, his name largely erased from the record, his fate unrecorded, his voice never captured for history the way his one morning of gunfire was, it did not take that. 31 men who would have killed Fox Company from beneath the water did not get the chance, because a man who used to be one of them decided on an ordinary Friday in June that he was not anymore.